Benjamin Franklin wasn't just sick, but his last hours were true torture? What if everything we know about his death is just part of a dark manipulation that unfolded in the very heart of America? In his final hours, Franklin endured pain that can be compared to torture. His last sufferings knew no bounds, and the political pressure from those around him was invisible yet terrifying. The true battle was not only with his illness, but with those who sought to use him. From the torture of illness to political manipulation, today we dive deep into the mysteries of Benjamin Franklin's last hours. What happened to him at the end of his life could change our understanding of how nations are built in history, and how, even in death, they are still controlled. The official version of Benjamin Franklin's death states that his last years were filled with serious illnesses. His health began to decline long before his death. Heart problems, arthritis, stomach pain. All of these ailments caused him constant suffering. Franklin suffered from pain, was unable to move properly, and was forced to spend most of his time in bed. Yet, even as his body was severely weakened, he did not give up. His determination and desire to remain active, even though he lacked physical strength, inspired those around him. But was his illness part of a more complicated political game? The hypothesis that Franklin, like many great figures, became the object of political manipulation arises from his final years. Could his political opponents have used his condition to accelerate his death? Through his illness, Franklin became vulnerable not only physically, but politically. In his last days, his health became a key issue for many of his allies and opponents. Perhaps his inability to actively participate in political decisions led to numerous manipulations aimed at shaping the future of the United States. Equally important was the psychological pressure that Franklin likely felt even in his final moments. He was a witness to numerous political intrigues unfolding around his legacy. He, who had been able to leave the country in the hands of his successors, now felt the pressure building as control over the situation slipped away. All these factors undoubtedly impacted his mental state. He likely felt that he could no longer control the situation, that he was left to watch as his country and his legacy changed without his input. The psychological pressure he faced likely became unbearable, exacerbated by his physical suffering. The physical agony that stretched across the last weeks of his life was excruciating. Franklin no longer had the strength for active political action, and his health left him with fewer and fewer chances of recovery. This led to a profound psychological breakdown. In those moments, the pressure from his opponents mounted, as his ability to respond dwindled. However, perhaps even more significant was the psychological pressure he faced due to the political manipulations surrounding his death. Thoughts of how his legacy and influence on the nation would be altered after his departure became an insurmountable burden. The political struggle for power became merciless. And so, when his physical suffering was already on the edge of endurance, the psychological pressure from the political changes surrounding the situation became another layer of torment. Benjamin Franklin was not just enduring physical pain. At this point in his life, his mind could no longer shield him from what was happening to his legacy. Franklin realized that he no longer had the influence he once wielded in his prime. Time and disease had forced him to become a passive observer as the future of the United States unfolded without him. In this moment, political pressure became not just an emotional challenge. It was a severe physical and mental strain. If the physical agony was excruciating, the psychological pressure from his political opponents was even more unbearable. The situation in which Franklin found himself unable to defend his legacy became intolerable. Political manipulations became the final phase of the battle for control. Franklin, once strong and influential, now found himself on the edge of physical and mental collapse. His diseases were not merely painful, they literally tortured his body, causing him to suffer for hours, and each movement became laborious and unbearable. But the worst part was that this torment did not cease, even in his final days. His heart, which refused to work, kidneys that no longer functioned, stomach pains that offered no relief even during sleep. This became his daily reality. These agonies, lasting for hours at a time, made him feel like a prisoner in his own body. He was on the verge of destruction, but his will remained strong. At the same time, as his body literally fell apart, Franklin felt that the political pressure left him no space for rest. His physical suffering became only part of the terrifying political game he was still playing, even when he lacked the strength to rise from his bed. The stomach pain was nothing compared to how his legacy was being manipulated. In those final hours of his failing body, Franklin felt his soul being torn apart. He longed to pass on his final political decisions, trying to maintain control over at least what was left of his legacy. But his physical state had become an insurmountable obstacle. His body betrayed him, and Franklin felt each of his last moments turn into a battle he wasn't prepared to fight. There was another fight, the one between Franklin and his political allies, who began using his fatal state for their own interests. At the point when he could no longer physically resist, some of his closest aides tried to manipulate his decisions, pushing him to sign documents that would determine the political future of the nation. This moment became not just a fight for political legacy, but a form of torture for him. His surroundings began to act, exploiting every weakness, every breath, to force him to surrender power. Franklin, knowing his life was nearly over, felt utterly powerless, yet he continued to resist, even at the brink of his strength. This psychological pressure became the greatest form of torture. Franklin, realizing that even his death had become part of the manipulations, understood that he no longer had control. He was merely a figure on a chessboard, moved by those seeking to achieve their political goals, even after he had left this world. Franklin, even before his physical collapse, still remained a symbol of strength and influence. His will was unwavering, and even as pain tore at his body, he sought to maintain control of the situation in the country. His mind, despite his weakening body, remained sharp and determined to find solutions, even if he was forced to rely on others. Yet even this inner resolve became a heavy burden. Franklin felt his body failing him, and all his efforts only contributed to more suffering. The political conflict, which emerged in his final moments, was not only the result of his physical ailments, but also a battle over his legacy. And here lies the question: would his legacy be the one he intended to leave behind? This internal conflict became his final enemy, as Franklin began to doubt whether he could pass the country into the hands of those who were capable of keeping it stable. He saw political forces around him trying to use his illness and weakness to achieve their own goals. His vulnerability became an opportunity for those eager to seize influence. And so, at the height of his physical vulnerability, manipulations of his legacy began. His surroundings, knowing he could no longer resist, sought to put him in a position where he could not influence the decisions. Their ambitions tore away his final words and decisions, and it was this that deepened his suffering. Franklin understood that even his death had become part of this cruel game. Political manipulations grew even harsher when it became clear that his legacy was in the hands of those who did not show him respect. His body and soul became victims of this merciless process, and even at the moment of his death, he remained a puppet in the political games that continued. Even more suffering came from the fact that after his death, there would be no peace or rest. Instead of being able to find tranquility in his final moments, Franklin agonized over the idea that his legacy would be distorted. This was not merely a fight for power, it was a battle for control over what he had built. And even after his death, political intrigues continued to destroy everything he had fought for. The final moments of his life became a dual torture, both physical and psychological. He became a victim not only of his own disease, but also of the cruel manipulations that drained his last strength. Research into the last hours of Benjamin Franklin's life leaves little room for definitive conclusions. Official documents and testimony about his death indicate that his final days were not just the result of physical decline, but also of political manipulations. From the moment Franklin began to experience significant physical suffering, his circle began actively using his condition to achieve their own goals. This was not just an illness. It was a process in which Franklin became a puppet in the hands of his political opponents, who sought to claim his legacy. Documents related to his final hours show that Even though Franklin was physically confined to his bed, his role in politics did not fade. It is known that even at the brink of death, his political influence remained in the spotlight. The documents indicate that during his final hours, political factions fighting for control over the future of the U.S. actively manipulated his state to gain access to the final decisions that would shape the nation's political landscape. Franklin, knowing his life was nearing its end, still tried to maintain his vision for the country's future. But his physical weakness prevented him from acting as a leader. Historians, analyzing Franklin's death, often ask, would his death have been avoided had there not been such strong political pressure? Could his last years have been less painful if he had not been surrounded by people who were eager to exploit his every move for their own interests? If not for the manipulations and intrigues, could his death have been more peaceful, free of these political conspiracies and backroom games? The comparison of different versions of Franklin's death brings up an important question. Was his decline a result of physical torture, or merely the outcome of natural illnesses? On one hand, it's well known that Franklin suffered from numerous ailments such as heart problems, arthritis, and stomach pain. His physical condition deteriorated day by day, and this undoubtedly contributed to his suffering. However, there's another theory suggesting that his final moments may have been part of a political game, where Franklin's body became a victim not only of disease, but also of human intrigue. Even after his death, his legacy remained at the center of political conflict. The conclusions drawn from analyzing Franklin's last hours support the notion that these moments remain one of the greatest mysteries in U.S. history. His final minutes weren't merely the end of a long journey. They transformed into a crucial stage in the political battle for his legacy. This period wasn't only about physical pain, but also a moment when Franklin's political influence turned into an object of manipulation. Had the political intrigue not stretched to the last moment, would his death have been less dramatic? These questions remain open, still prompting us to consider the real impact that the death of this great political figure had on the future development of the country. Franklin's last moments were not only physical suffering, but also the point at which political manipulation reached its peak. Feeling that his life was coming to an end, Franklin found himself under relentless political pressure that grew stronger each day. Even though he was nearly physically incapacitated, his surroundings actively exploited his weakness to change the political landscape of the U.S. in their favor. The final political manipulation Franklin faced at the end of his life was the fact that his legacy became a battleground for those seeking power. Franklin, feeling his physical helplessness, could no longer fully control the situation. His decisions, which had become his sole instrument of influence in his final days, were being manipulated by those seeking to use his illness as an opportunity to make their own political moves. At this point, even though physically weakened, Franklin left behind a legacy that likely didn't entirely match his original vision. He likely realized that his ideas and views could be twisted and used by his political opponents. Franklin was a staunch advocate of democracy and equality, but was his legacy, in the hands of future generations, still the same as he had envisioned? These last moments became a crossroads where the fate of the country was determined not only by his physical state, but also by who had the ultimate power over political processes. The intrigues and manipulations became even more pronounced in the final moments of Franklin's life, when he no longer had the strength to protest. Specifically, the question arose as to who would take on the role of leader after him. There were contradictions about who should lead the nation and whose political views should dominate in the future of the United States. Thus, the political pressure on Franklin, though physically incapacitated, increased until the end of his life, creating a new reality for the country. In these final moments, when Franklin could no longer actively influence political processes, he undoubtedly felt an internal conflict. His will, mind, and experience remained inexhaustible, but physical limitations became an obstacle to his participation in further political changes. Franklin realized that the country he had long helped shape would exist without his active participation. This was a painful realization for him, that what he left behind might not be exactly what he had intended. This internal conflict, tormenting Franklin in his final moments, became, without a doubt, his greatest torment. Helpless, he was forced to watch as his ideas and political legacy fell apart under the influence of those willing to manipulate his last decisions. As a leader who had held the country in his hands for so long, he felt his legacy might be lost, or even used for reverse political manipulations. In addition to physical suffering, this psychological pressure undoubtedly became the most painful aspect of his last moments. Franklin endured invisible torment, no less destructive than any physical pain. The psychological battle with those around him, who sought to gain an advantage over his legacy, added to his suffering. This struggle for influence and control over America was especially painful for him, as he could no longer change the course of events. Franklin, undoubtedly one of the greatest figures of his time, found that his final hours became a relentless reminder of how politics can destroy a person. While the physical torment was ongoing, it was the psychological pressure and internal conflict that were the heaviest trials for him. Therefore, even after his death, political intrigues and the fight for his legacy remained painful for him, making him agonize over what would remain after him. It was these final moments of life, the combination of physical suffering and political manipulations, that made Franklin's death not just a personal tragedy, but a political torture that would change the course of U.S. history for years to come. It is unknown how many more manipulations of his legacy took place after his death. Benjamin Franklin's death, despite his immense influence on the creation of the United States, was just the beginning of the fight for control over his legacy. His physical departure did not mark the end of his political game. Those who remained after him used his name and political legacy to achieve their own ambitions. Although Franklin was one of the founding fathers, his legacy after his death became a field of manipulation. Political parties, allies, and even personal enemies sought to redistribute the influence he left behind and rewrite the political ideals he embodied. Historians still debate whether his legacy can be considered pure, or if it was distorted after his death. What truly transpired in the political corridors of that time when Franklin could no longer control the situation? Even hundreds of years after his death, it is difficult to precisely determine how many manipulations and intrigues took place in his absence. His legacy became a tool for others to strengthen their political standing. No matter how much Franklin tried to build a state founded on the ideals of democracy and equality, after his death, all those ideals became vulnerable to political exploitation. What he left behind became a battleground for power, where the true goal was not to embody his principles, but to use his name for personal gain. Franklin did not only fail to find physical peace, but political peace as well. And this raises the question of what we can take from his legacy. Franklin's legacy not only remains a topic of controversy due to his physical death, but also because of the political chaos it spawned. While he left behind a significant national inheritance, the question of how exactly his legacy was used after his death still lacks a clear answer. We are left to wonder what intrigues and manipulations took place in the shadows of his grave. His political legacy, though marked by grand ideas such as freedom and equality, was immediately subject to attempts at redistribution and usage for personal goals. These political manipulations raise the question, can his legacy still be considered pure and untarnished after political forces exploited his name for their own interests? The true meaning of Franklin's legacy takes on new significance when we reflect on how his ideas and political principles were interpreted after his death. How can we perceive his legacy today, when the leader who held everything in control is no longer here? What can we truly take from what he left behind, considering all the political manipulations that became part of his legacy after his death? This question remains relevant even today, as we try to understand how the legacy of one of the greatest leaders in world history could be distorted and used by the political forces that came after him. Do you believe Benjamin Franklin's death was the result of political manipulation? Is it possible that his final days were just part of a grand political game that didn't end even after his physical death? Franklin was not just a leader, he was a symbol of strength and ideals for the entire nation. And the question of whether his ideas changed after his death remains unanswered. Did his legacy truly remain pure, or did political intrigue seep into its foundations? We know that many great leaders have become symbols even after their death. But can their legacies be manipulated by political forces? Can we truly say that Franklin left behind a legacy he would have been proud of? Or is what remains only the result of efforts by those who used his name to achieve their own goals? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective may become part of this fascinating discussion. How would you assess the role of political manipulation in the history of great leaders? Are there examples in history where the death of a leader sparked even greater intrigues and changes in the political landscape? Next time, an investigation into how political manipulation alters the course of history for great leaders after their death. History is filled with examples where the death of a great figure became a catalyst for new political conspiracies and struggles for power. We'll examine the most shocking cases where, after a leader's death, other political players began manipulating the legacy, trying to reinterpret and even distort his will. How do politicians and state actors use death to alter the course of history for their benefit? How does the death of one leader become a strategic moment for subsequent political moves? We'll explore these manipulations and uncover the biggest secrets they hide. Don't miss the next episode.